What is mastery learning and why does it matter? How and where and when do we make mastery judgments? What does mastery have to do with deeper learning, especially in this age of AI? You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast. I'm Tom Vander Ark, and to discuss a few of those questions, we're welcoming Dr. Tony Wagner and Dr. Ulrik Christensen, authors of a great new book, Mastery: Why Deeper Learning is Essential in the Age of Distraction. Ulrik and Tony, welcome.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Tony, I think this is number 8, book number
It is.
8. I loved the first 7, learned a lot from them like the rest of the world, but really appreciate this one.
Well, I got very lucky in that Ulrik and I decided to partner on this, and I think his perspective just enriched the book immeasurably.
Ulrik, you have such an interesting background. You're a medical doctor by original training, and also a tech executive and an ed tech executive. Why did the subject of mastery learning interest you? I'm particularly interested in because you experienced the licensure system, right? Your professional background and your recent experience in ed tech, were those part of the interest in writing this book?
Yeah, so I think the important part of that story is that my original interest was really in human factors and how do you avoid human errors on operating teams and in emergency medicine. So I was building simulators first. So it was all applied knowledge. It was all, how do you get teams to work? How do you get them to communicate? How do you get people to learn how to learn? And part of that was actually led to the need to solve another problem, which is the one we're most known for, which is this adaptive learning thing where how do you acquire knowledge? But that has never been the goal. It's never really been my big interest. It was just a means to an end, because what we could see was that when we were trying to get physicians and nurses to actually perform better under pressure, often their knowledge models broke down. They didn't know enough. They didn't know it in a way that they could actually use it. So it's this thing about you had these extreme cases of professionals who've been through like a dozen years of training or more, and then the knowledge they had was in many ways useless. So how do we? And that led to a 15-year detour of my career. But that's of course why my real interest is still what you can do with what you know, not really how many plastic cards you can get or how many like standardized tests you can pass.
I really appreciate that, and that thought sort of comes to life in the subtitle, Why Deeper Learning is Essential in the Age of Distraction. This book is really about deeper learning, how you learn and apply useful knowledge quickly and in context. So I really appreciate your professional interest in this. I want to come back and talk about how the world has changed in the 4 years since this book idea was launched. But Tony, mastery learning, are you how do you feel about the title and subject of this book? Because it felt like it really became a deeper learning book.
I'm delighted. I'm delighted by it. And I credit Ulrik for pushing me in this direction. He was fond of saying, look, the global achievement gap is a great description of what's wrong with education. But you really need to go further and talk about where we should be going with education. And I was on the track when I wrote about the 7 survival skills in the global achievement gap. I was really talking about the importance of skills over academic content knowledge. And that's one of the starting points for this book. But then what's been fun is really learning about all of these experiments, this R&D that's been going on for the last 15 years since I started writing the global achievement gap, where many people are moving towards a more mastery-based or competency-based curriculum from K to Gray. And so that's what's new and different about this book, or all of these really rich and interesting examples, both from the workplace and from K through college, K through graduate school, that really come alive.
I was happy that the book really came to life in that way with a description of so many powerful learning experiences and learning environments. I guess a reflection off the top that mastery learning, or some people would say competency-based learning, has, by many of its adherents, been turned into a sterile exercise, usually limited to basic skills, obsessed with making accurate, discrete judgments, and in doing so, making learning boring as hell.
Yeah.
And there are still a few networks of schools that treat mastery that way. Narrow definition, small bites, right answers, and no application. And I was really happy to find that your book didn't spend any time on those. You really explored environments that have a fresh set of learning goals, Tony, many of them built on your 7 survivor skills. I think in many respects, the durable skills movement of today probably built on those survival skills. So I loved what I found.
Well, we make that distinction early on, Tom, because that concerned us. We didn't want our work associated with what has become a kind of another new form of drudgery in American education. And the key distinction that we make is around motivation, intrinsic motivation, something I know you're deeply concerned with. You talk about co-authorship. Other folks talk about agency, but the idea is developing not just the skill, but also the will to really master something, to become good at something, proficient. So we argue that voice and choice, student voice and choice, are absolutely an essential element of any mastery-based learning enterprise.
And you can say, Tom, that it was really a deliberate decision here to say, are we willing to just give up on what the term mastery could really mean because somebody has abused it, or at least had let it slide? Or should we try to redefine it to what it really should be meaning? Because we were seeking high and low for what else? What would be could we frame it in a different way, what we were trying to say? And then we decided to say, let's actually try to see if we could redefine the stakes here.
And of course, it helped that we were both on the board of the Mastery Transcript Consortium, and they were already using the terminology in ways that we agreed with. And so we, in a sense, are building on what MTC started. And you were still there.
Tony, I want to, let's jump into the middle of the book with that invitation in the chapter on secondary schools, where you really bring to life what mastery learning, what deeper learning could look like. You start out with our friends at Gibson Eck here in Issaquah, Washington. It is a big picture school. Tony, I remember you introduced me to big picture in Peter McWalter's office in 1999, and schools are still innovating on that model. Gibson Eck added the mastery transcript to the big picture model. Why start that chapter out with the Gibson Eck story?
Well, there's different approaches to mastery-based learning. Some are adaptations of the existing high school model, like CAPS is really working only in the area of elective courses. And as we all know, kids have fewer and fewer elective options in high school. So that's a very limited intervention. Whereas Gibson Elk starts from scratch. They say, tabula rasa, let's imagine the way school really could and should be. And I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart, Tom. You've been at this for 25 years now, I think, right?
Since you were my district coach here in Federal Way. Ulrik, before we started recording, we were talking about this experience gap that's opening up, where it's harder for young people to get really great learning experiences, and they're more and more required to get that first job. So there's this opening up of an employment gap. And Tony mentioned the CAPS network. I'm on the board there and a super fan. It's national network of schools and career centers that are trying to create internships and client-connected projects and entrepreneurial experiences that will help give kids a set of experiences that I hope stack into closing that experience gap. But Ulrik, I was surprised and pleased to find them as an example of what powerful and mastery learning looks like.
Yeah, and I agree. And then another one, I know you're very familiar with the Spark NC project in North Carolina. That is also a really strong attempt to say, how do we get education closer to useful skills and the kinds of the total toolbox that I think will be needed one thing that is interesting is that when we started writing the book, this was probably an aspiration for a much better world, where today it's an imperative to deal with this, because as an example, we have reduced in our company, we used to hire a lot of people with an academic background as learning engineers. We have reduced that by 80-90% in less than 12 months. And we are maybe a little bit ahead of the curve, but this is something that will be pervasive in the academically heavy jobs. And that leads to then the next part is, but what instead, and who will actually benefit from this? And I've spent the entire summer suddenly programming after 35 years of giving up on all aspirations of programming. And today it's like, I'm able to do things where we needed an army of people, whether it was for analytics or for basic legwork or coding, but a lot of those entry-level jobs that are down 35% in a year and a half in terms of job postings in the US. If we have that situation, we're suddenly ending up with a no man's land between people graduating and where you can contribute enough to actually be employable. So that lack of employability that Tony has written about, 7 books about, is suddenly way more of a clear and present danger than it's ever been before.
Ulrik, you just did a beautiful job of describing a post-secondary learning journey, right? It's sort of a new vision for mastery learning. It was purposeful. It was embedded in real, authentic work. It was in real time. It had cycles of demonstrated learning, right? So it was iterative, it was demonstrated. It's quite different than the dated picture that many people might have of mastery learning, which is very sequential, right and wrong answers. This is I think a much more dynamic, applied, generative vision of what mastery learning could look like.
I agree. And I think I have not felt this since I was 8. Like this summer, I've woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning going back to coding because I'm able to build things that I'm interested in. I don't have to wait for anybody. And then I've been able to draw on people to learn new things. And at the level where we're actually discussing now that mastery learning of this kind, we have to be careful. Our blood pressures are increasing, but this is something that is so addictive that you can become so productive that we also need to take care of that problem at some point. But coming back to the scary thing is asking the questions and being able to define what good looks like is something that has a huge bias towards people who are already experienced, who are already extremely knowledgeable.
Yes.
That maybe leads to the final important point there, which is people who think that knowledge is going to go away are dead wrong. Like the more you know, the more you'll be able to benefit from this wave of possibilities that are there.
In part because you can ask better questions. You can recognize opportunity. That takes knowledge and skill as well as curiosity. I want to do a little deep dive on an initiative, entrepreneurship, skills that I think are brand new priorities and skills that you've been just describing, Ulrik. Tony, in 7 survival skills, number 3 was agility and adaptability. Number 4 was initiative and entrepreneurship. You probably wrote that book 12 years ago.
14.
That advice is super prescient. I think these are the most important priorities. You were talking about them 13, 14 years ago. They're just beginning to show up in people's portrait of a graduate or learner profile. So I don't know, a series of challenges here that I want to have you describe for us. One, you have to name these as priorities. And then 2, you really have to completely rethink the kind of learner experience that would cultivate agility, initiative, entrepreneurship. Those are things not cultivated by a traditional learning environment and traditional learning experiences. So I don't know, say more about how we make those priorities and what kinds of new experiences do we need to create space for, permission for, support for?
Well, one of the things we sort of begin with as a premise in the book is if you're really saying all kids can reach the similar levels of competency, through life stages, but I'd say in a 17, 18-year-old, they're not going to all do that at the same time. So that's the first premise or foundation of education that we attempt to dismantle, that individual learning, people learn or master things at different rates. So that's point one. So we sort of basically discard the whole idea of seat time served as a basis for a credit. We believe you should have to demonstrate core competencies, and you can do them in lots of different ways, through internships, through presentations and defenses of knowledge, through portfolios, as the Mastery Transcript Consortium does. But then that leads to the second idea of individualizing each person's ways in which they're going to both develop mastery and show competence. So you just, one size absolutely cannot fit all in this world. And then that gets back to the problem of assessment, the standardized forms of assessment, which have driven education increasingly into the ground, I would say, for the last 25 years, does not serve these purposes in any way, shape, or form. You have to use more qualitative forms of assessment. I'm fond of saying, let's be less data-driven, although there's a role for that, and more evidence-based, collective human judgment informed by evidence is what I think becomes the new norm for this more qualitative form of assessment. And if you're not assessing these skills, just naming them is a nice exercise, but it gets you absolutely nowhere. And if you're not changing the curriculum in terms of both time and experience, you're not going to get anywhere. So the problem with so many of these profiles is, they name all the right things, but then they don't change anything. They don't change assessment.
Yeah.
They don't change time. They don't change curriculum.
Ulrik, what you were describing to me is a sprint to value. You were trying to create value for a community. You spotted an opportunity to create value, and you've put yourself on this iterative sprint. That, to me, is the heart of entrepreneurship. And that's why I was so excited to see so many examples of that kind of learning in both the secondary, post-secondary chapters. That strikes me, though, as not typical of how we think of mastery learning, because it's hard to assess a value contribution. How much value did you add to your community, if that's really the desired outcome? Is that a new challenge?
Well, so I think that the nice thing is that with what I just described is like there are some very concrete things that comes out of it that you can assess and that you can touch and feel, right? And if they are relevant, so just the fact on which problems you choose to embark on trying to solve, and if they have relevance, it's a different kind of thing that you like when you're trying to prove that I did 20 hours of community service by serving lemonade at the church or whatever. Whereas if you've actually solved the problem by developing the new planning app for the local community, or you've built, you're an entrepreneur who is solving a problem that has social relevance, or for that matter, that you just show that you're a thinking person that can think outside like short tweets and reels. So I think there are different ways we can accumulate the evidence of what's going on.
I got a great question at the last ASU GSV conference where somebody stood up and said, should we assess outcomes of individuals and teams using smart tools? Should we credential work done with a co-intelligence? So in other words, you described this sprint that you're on of using coding tools to create an app, and what's being assessed is the quality of that app that you produced with a co-intelligence. So that's an interesting new assessment question. Should we be assessing outcomes that used a co-intelligence, co-writing, co-coding? What's your take on that?
I think so. The 7 or 8 different projects I've done over the summer, and that's not over exaggerating. If you look at the width and breadth of those, I think that it would be very easy for humans to say why they're relevant, what impact they've had. Whereas if you try to explain to a chatbot what it was or try to come up with some kind of a standardized measure, I actually think it will be a harder problem to write that code and that application that will do that. And I think that for some of this, there is a really large part of it coming back to the way the MTC also, like the main idea here is, which is like just transparency of what it was you produced, like what came out of it, might actually for a while be the better option. So I think I'm not so fixated on trying to solve everything with technology. I'm actually a big fan of making hybrid solutions. And I think something here where we come up with a good architecture that makes it evident and transparent what lies behind it, with humans who are able to put human common sense behind where this fits in. It might actually be something where we have to live with the risk that it's not an exact science, but it's something that is better, which standardized tests are not either. Well, they're exactly bad, right? Or unreliable. So I think that we just have to live with a different kind of risk and inaccuracy.
Tony, let's go back to elementary and paint a picture or two of what this might look like in an elementary. You gave some really great examples in the book. You want to mention one or two?
Well, the examples that we describe, both a group of charter schools in Hawaii and independent school, Redbridge, started by Early Friedman, have in common that they're primarily focused on social emotional learning, something we used to focus on in kindergarten at least, and gave up with what has become increasingly a test prep curriculum, really beginning in kindergarten and first grade.
Right.
So, a reading of those chapters might suggest that's all these schools cared about, but in the background, they are also critically focused on those core competencies. There's a great story from the Redbridge kid. There's no grades in Redbridge. Kids can apply twice a year to go to the next level of autonomy, as they describe it. So this 6-year-old is applying for the next level of autonomy, and his teachers, in the process of assessing and making this joint decision, remind him that, there's going to be a level of reading required in this next level of autonomy, of reading directions, reading for understanding that might be challenging for you. And he came back a day or two later and said, this is 6 years old, mind you. He said, I've thought about this. I think I need more time to get better at reading. So that when you have that kind of conversation, both about the hard skill of reading, but also the skill of self-assessment and reflection, then you've got an incredibly powerful foundation for lifelong learning, which is one of the core arguments we make in the book. Today's world, more than any other moment in history, demands that for us to thrive, for work, for civic engagement, for personal health and well-being, lifelong learning becomes the highest priority.
Tony, in our very first conversation about this book 3 or 4 years ago, we talked about the importance of agency, of learners sort of owning the outcomes and being able to self-assess. And so your story about Redbridge was a beautiful one, where students petitioned to advance to the next level of autonomy. So they're making the case for their own advancement by demonstrating their own. Redbridge kids really own their own learning. And Tony, I think you sent me to Chugach, Alaska in 99, and I saw the same thing, where kids owned their own learning. They could tell you right where they were, and they could describe what they needed to do to move to the next level of autonomy. So your stories made me smile about that sense of agency and ownership.
I remember for the Chugach example, which is a K-12 competency-based curriculum, kids had a map on their desks of what the competencies were going to be that they had to show proficiency with in order to graduate. And they had to map their way through this flow chart, if you will, to those levels of proficiency. And each one had a different path, but they all had a clear understanding of where they had to be in 5 or 7 years.
Tony, I'll jump to college. I think you also took me to Olin College for my first visit, probably in 2001 or 2. We met President Rick Miller, who I hung out with last week, by the way. I'd love both of you to sort of reflect on a fresh vision for higher ed and what this could look like. And so, Tony, is Olin a good picture of what's next?
I think it's a great model. It's a great example. And once again, none of these are perfect. And, you might argue, well, Redbridge is, an independent school. Olin is not cheap, but they're all doing the kind of educational R&D that I think are what's required. In Olin's case, all the courses are interdisciplinary. They're problem-based or challenge-based. Students do, I don't know how many projects every year. I think by the end of the year, the end of 4 years, they've done 12 major projects. including as a requirement for their senior year that they work in a team on a real world problem in a real company or nonprofit.
Right.
So these kids are being snapped up by all of the high-tech companies because they are so far beyond the entry-level employees who are coming out of other colleges, including MIT, Caltech, and the others.
Ulrik, investor Ryan Craig suggests that apprenticeships are part of the post-secondary solution, and maybe 3% of American workers get access to apprenticeships. He thinks it should be a 30% solution. And do you see apprenticeships and more broadly sort of earn and learn ladders as part of the post-secondary solution?
I think that's an absolute given. If you look at the quantum leap that a university like Northeastern has taken, based on doing these co-ops where they insist on integrating it into a college experience. But I think that it's very closely tied together to what we just talked about with owning the journey. And one of the things that was scary when we did this was that for the adults, it was actually really, really hard to find good mastery-based and deeper learning examples outside professions that had a very certain characteristic, which was that you were dying or your patients or your clients were dying, or there was like severe disability, at least as a consequence, if you didn't have mastery learning. And the most extreme ones are the ones where you're dying yourself. So if you took pilots originally who went to true proficiency based, you had to be able to prove things in a simulator, to the one we're profiling unproportionally, Tony would say in the book, but it's because it's the most extreme example. It's the most extreme cave divers. That's why I'm here in Sardinia to try to work on these R&D projects with them. But that's because these divers die themselves. And the ones who are left now are the ones who didn't die during the 90s and the zeros when they were doing all these explorations. So it's the true educators who are still alive. And that comes back to a really important point about teamwork. First of all, they own the end goal to stay alive. But the second part is because they perform as team later, all education is geared around team performance. I remember when I took their first courses, I was surprised that when they were doing skills evaluations, that you are allowed to help each other. Actually, you're not allowed not to help each other. That you could be the one who is not on the spot to do some basic drill underwater, and the instructor afterwards would say, "So why didn't you help? If you saw that, why didn't you say it?" And that was an eye-opening experience as an adult who's gone through so much postgraduate training, and then suddenly it's not an option, it's a requirement. And we didn't find many of those in adult life, and colleges are almost even worse because they're so individualistic that I think the Olin model and similar models, they have to break this silo down where you perform as an individual for 4 years in college.
I want to start to wrap up with some thoughts on scaling and how we take this new vision for powerful learning to scale. Ulrik, I wrote a book 5 years ago on platform networks, and I'm convinced that platform networks are at least part of the solution here. Earlier, you mentioned Spark NC, and it strikes me as a great example of a network of high schools in North Carolina using your Area 9 platform to create modular, competency-based, stackable experiences that students can co-author into pathways. And in your book, you also mentioned Building 21, a great example of a competency-based, very experiential learning network of schools. I assume you share my conviction that platform networks are going to be a part of taking this vision to scale?
Absolutely. And if you don't end up with this intertwining of all the different players and their interest in this, I think we will continue in this, I don't know what we should call it, isolationism, if that's even an English word, that education has suffered from, where that's just not the new world. The new world is different.
I'm reminded of Etienne Wenger's concept of communities of practice. And I deeply believe that communities of practice, focusing and solving problems of practice, are the true engine of change. And education is one of the most isolated professions in modern work life. So the platform's essential, but I also think there are enabling policies that we could get into, which have to change to make that platform work more productive and powerful.
Tony, you made the case around page 100, I think, probably in the assessment chapter, that all of these schools that you featured, almost all of these schools, were playing a double game. They were doing mastery education, and then they had to do this translation to survive in the world. And so these schools are really doing double work. And so I want to just echo that states have a real opportunity to create spaces for these schools to grow and then to scale. So yeah, policy matters, right?
Absolutely. And it's policy that enables this kind of educational R&D. That means taking a hard look at certification requirements for new schools. It means rethinking assessment practices. It means funding R&D. I mean, I argue really that every district ought to have a lab school, that it ought to be just built in. And that's where we train teachers instead of in these isolated universities that churn out graduates who haven't the faintest idea of where to start teaching. So there's a kind of multiple win-win here if we really rethink some of these long-standing structures.
Ulrik, this isn't your eighth book. What was the process like writing a book with Tony? And
so I think it was fascinating because we had discussed many of these things before, and the book came about because we were both frustrated that there were too few solutions, and also like the daunting task of deciding to span from like at least first or second grade and all the way up through like retirement almost ended up being it also took 4 years. It took a lot longer than we expected. We probably did twice as many interviews and twice as much research as we expected to do. But luckily we had a publisher that was very patient and basically said, we don't care about when the book is ready, as long as it's good.
It's a super important contribution. We're talking to Tony Wagner and Ulrik Christensen about their new book, Mastery, Why Deeper Learning is Essential in an Age of Distraction. Tony, any shout outs do you want to give? Any words of gratitude for any folks that helped you on this journey?
Well, there were lots of folks. First of all, Sujata Bhatt added really great content to the book, did a number of interviews, some of the site visits. She was very helpful. The network, Tom, that you have continued to sort of feed in so many ways is doing in such incredible work. There's so many people we could be thanking for all of the R&D, the sacrifices that they have made to enable this new kind of education to emerge and begin to thrive. It's just, without the courage of these educators who are in the trenches every day, we would have had nothing to write about.
Tony, it was such a fun read because I turned the page and I get a big smile. I said, "Oh yeah, I remember when Tony took me there." They're still doing the Lord's work. It was a lot of fun, and it was even better than expected. We'd encourage everybody to get a copy of Mastery: Why Deeper Learning is Essential in an Age of Distraction. An important contribution. It was a good idea 4 years ago, Ulrik. I think it's a must-read today for the new and confusing challenges that we face. I think the book's even more relevant. So thank you. Thanks to our producer, Mason Pasha, and the whole Getting Smart team that makes this possible every week. And until next week, keep learning, keep leading, keep innovating for mastery.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast.